The UFC has been accused of having a monopoly that allows them to break their fighters.
Would you fight again under that contract?
No, I took this fight because I want to make sure that regardless I've been wrongly treated, I can make my case of saying I've accomplished each fight.
Break other promotions.
You know, he's got it in his head that there's bigger opportunities outside the UFC. You're going to fight arguably the greatest fighter of all time. You'd be the highest paid heavyweight ever in UFC history. Or you think there's more money out there to fight somebody who isn't the greatest of all time, somebody who is a lesser opponent.
And completely dominate and not allow any newcomer in the business.
Everyone's been telling me not to speak up, and if you want to stay with the company, be quiet.
If you look at the history of the UFC, which I covered in this video right here, you can see why people see it this way. However, is it really broken, or is there a possibility for change? After all, many people have tried to destroy this monopoly, and some people don't even think it's a monopoly.
It's not a monopoly. You do have choices, but there's one clear top of the food chain choice, but it's because they do it the best.
And there's also something to be said there. Some of these tactics are just regular business practices in general. The thing is, it's not black or white. It's all up to interpretation, and there's a lot to read between the lines. Regardless, if you're a fighter and you're trying to fight for a better life in the UFC, there are 3 avenues that could save you right now. These avenues are antitrust lawsuits, speaking of the monopolies, the Ali Act, an act that has taken place in boxing and now it's trying to make its way into MMA, and a fighters association. Something has been tried to get done for a long time now, and it's yet to happen through the power of collective bargaining agreements. I have depicted these 3 actions as if an MMA god is going to descend and completely change the industry if these things are applied. But in reality, it is a lot harder, obviously. It's not just as simple as let's create an alliance. However, there's a feel-good sentiment that the hopeful can latch onto. The fact that the wheels are in motion and change could just be around the corner, which is still true to a certain extent, but are we judging from just appearance of what we want to believe or actual reality? The reality of these efforts, the reality of their potential success, and the potential impact that they could have is more complicated, and I would argue far less dramatic than most people would think. Let's start it out with something that has already affected the business of MMA: antitrust lawsuits.
The UFC is facing legal action from current and former MMA fighters, but what exactly is this lawsuit all about?
The top 5% of the athletes in our sport make a pretty decent living. There's 95% of the athletes in our sport that are struggling to make a living.
And the truth is, fighters are not paid what they're worth in terms of market dictated value.
It's been 8 years since Kung Lee and all there filed a lawsuit against the UFC.
Potentially, I think there could be like $4 billion worth of damages awarded. I mean, does that concern you at all with the
Not even a little bit. It concerns me so much that I don't even know anything about it.
Currently, the imminent official written opinion of a plaintiff class certification is what's holding up the entire process. Now, really, you don't know what any of that means, and to be honest, I don't know what that means, but the important thing is that these need to get done before the case ever goes into court. But it will not be the last step before that.
That'll be coming out soon. After that, we have 30 days for the UFC's attorneys to submit an appeal to the Ninth Circuit. That's the question. Will the Ninth Circuit take up the appeal? I do think there is a strong case. I think the Ninth Circuit will turn down that appeal.
However, Jason Cruz is not as hopeful of a 2024 trial.
What we need to start the appeal process is a written opinion. At that point, it would go back down to the trial court for further litigation. So we're talking multiple years before we actually get to a point where a trial date will be set. We could be looking closer to the later 2020s for this to actually sniff a courtroom.
All right, so assuming some appeals will happen, that means that this lawsuit could take place in the courtroom between 2024 and 2028. However, the fighters clearly have a case, and this means that if the case goes to court, then the fighters clearly have a victory, right? Not quite. Nothing is really that simple in the legal system.
It really is dependent upon a lot of rulings that will go forward even before trial, a lot of pretrial litigation that occurs. Could the fighters prove their particular case regarding monopoly and monopsony? That will be up to Judge market bullwhip and what evidence he will rely on when it gets to that particular point. At this particular point, if he grants class certification for the bout class of fighters, I would foresee a hard road to prove the actual damages that they're claiming.
And after speaking to some other lawyers, a lot of them coincide in the idea that if this case does go to court, the likelihood of the fighters winning is not all that big. And Endeavor is fully expected to take a chance on it and not settle out of court, meaning that Endeavor would most likely win this scenario. The only reason why Endeavor would ever settle this lawsuit is because they think they might lose and to avoid the catastrophic results. And the results would be catastrophic. We're talking about $5 billion in unpaid wages. Keep in mind the UFC was bought for $4 billion. So at best, the monetary compensation should be within the hundreds, but remember this money would be split across all UFC fighters over the 7-year period.
I don't think they would be drastically more what they currently did. Let's say if they went to a 3-year maximum sunset provision instead of the 5-year or 4-year even. That is still a major difference. 4 years is a long time, but it's not. A lot of fighters do end up, they fight 2 years, and then at that point you're like, well, I want to sit out. I can sit out a year or two. That would be a massive victory for fighters. I do see them settling for probably hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, but think how big the UFC is now. Since they've waited this long in the case, that is not an existential threat to the UFC. That's not the end of the UFC. That's a portion of their EBITDA for 1 year. Let's say, I'm just throwing out a number and I have no basis for what that number is going to be, but let's say they say we're going to settle for $500 million. A few years ago, before Endeavor bought them, before they got an ESPN, that could have potentially crippled the UFC. Now it's like, well, we kind of lose our profits for 1 year. They settle it, the investors might take a slight hit, but the investors now like, oh, it's settled, it's out of the way, we don't have to worry about this anymore.
Worst case scenario, the UFC crushes this trial and lawsuit entirely and nothing is gained. However, that statement itself is not entirely accurate because the lawsuit itself has already made a ton of progress. The UFC conducts their business and their contracts.
Nick, Corey, John Fitch, all those guys, they've actually accomplished stuff and they get basically no credit. They all often get mocked by fans for being disgruntled, but they're the guys that got the contracts to change. They're the guys that got a hearing in Congress that released all the information about the UFC finances. So the talking point that everybody talks about, the UFC only pays 18, 17%, that didn't come from people like making it up or finding on their own. That came from those guys in Discovery. So they've done a ton of the work and they get none of the credit.
Of course, the agonizing, slow stage of the legal system is not the only hope that the fighters have. The Ali Expansion Act also could be passed in theory to also affect MMA. And this could literally change over the course of a single day's time.
Senator Mark Wayne Mullen has at least suggested the idea of extending the Ali Act protections to mixed martial arts. Is that something you'd support?
Absolutely. And I've already heard that the martial arts people are inclined to support such a measure.
Couture, a cage star turned Hollywood actor, says the Muhammad Ali Act can help.
Estamos tentando trazer pro MMA o ato do Muhammad Ali.
The Ali Act means that he can't keep 85% of the money, that other people are going to come in and bid for those fights, and he has to be in a competitive wage market.
Fighters are getting about 15% of revenues. In major sports, it's 50%. The Ali Act would change that.
They take all the merchandise, they take all the pay-per-views, they take all the gate, keep all the money, and then they give whatever they want to the fighter. Here's $100,000. We think that's worthy, even though they made $100 million.
Literally, it's just as easy as passing a bill and all the problems are solved, right? Right? If this were to work, sweeping changes would come. Contracts could be nullified. New promotions could pop up to make the new market competitive. Championships could be made independent of the promotion. Fighters could take control of the business by taking sponsorships like Nike, like I covered in this video. And the eventual slide into what boxing has become with all these governing bodies and a complete mess of the sport, which is not completely positive. But also, it's not that simple because there's another thing.
One thing that exists in MMA is the UFC. There's this 800-pound gorilla that has almost all the revenue coming through it. The UFC brand's so strong, conceivably, they add sales to the pay-per-views. So they could still pay a smaller percentage, but much more than they're currently, and match whatever anybody else is paying, because their brand is going to add to the sales. Top fighters might make more now if they're free to leave to go to Showtime, PFL, or Bellator, but the UFC could easily increase the amount of they're paying fighters to match or surpass with those other ones, even if they're getting millions now, and still pay a much lower percentage than those other promotions. They just have to pay a much higher percentage than they currently do. You wouldn't see this fracturing because the UFC can easily still outbid everybody. So even if the Ollie Act was as far-reaching as it conceivably could be, you would still have a promotion with tons of money that could basically outperform any other promotion. People think the whole sport would be completely collapsed if it, that we'd instantly be boxing. I do think if the big one is, do you separate the title from the promoter? And that's a big question because it's not clear in the Ali Act. It's kind of suggested under the idea that you can't have compensation from a promoter to a sanctioning organization. But you could make that clearer in a new, a new expansion act. If you made that clear and made that sure that clarify that the promoter cannot be have their own titles, have to use an outside independent sanctioning organization for titles. That's a huge impact because fighters now, a promoter can no longer use the leverage of saying you can only get a fight for the title if you sign with us.
The way he proposed it was seems so hastily made and just cut and paste revision of boxing's Ali Act. It would have been more impressive if he were to put forth some sort of specifics regarding MMA. I don't foresee any impact at all from the Ali Act expansion that was proposed by Senator Mark Lane. And I doubt, if at all, it would have any bearing on helping fighters' health and safety. And moreover, I don't see any worth in any legislative function as far as how that Ali Act expansion would go. It would be just a waste of time for any lawmaker to try to pass that thing. It's not worth anything. It doesn't do anything for MMA fighters. I personally don't think that the Ali Act for boxing has helped boxers that much because promoters have found ways around the legislation. I think that the boxing's Ali Act needs to be refreshed.
Alright, so the Ali Act has tons of problems, and if it were to expand to MMA, it would likely not see the sweeping changes in the form it is right now. However, there's another huge other issue affecting this right now, and that is the fact that Congress really doesn't care too much about MMA in the first place. And so with the antitrust lawsuit not going through at all, and the Ali Act not looking great at all, what about the athletes actually taking care of it themselves? Not in a court ruling, but rather in a collective bargaining agreement. This is what every other sport out there uses, and it's also officially known as associations.
It's not a question of if it should happen, a union, it's a question of when it will happen. It will happen, because it happened in boxing, it happened in basketball, in hockey.
It's like we already don't have a lot of leverage, bro. Like there's only so many things that we could even do.
We're here to take every step necessary to make sure that no athletic, no athlete, no fight in the UFC gets left behind.
Just the healthcare and the pension and the what do we do next and the what do we need to do right now. That's the part to me that thing needs to be heard.
I've been feeling like this for a long time, and I know that all the other fighters have too, actually. It's just that nobody wants to get on the bad side of the UFC.
Fighters, they'll say off the record, maybe not on the record, but off the record, they'll say they want a union or an association, some sort of representation. I remember Chad Dundas did a survey of them, and it was like 80%. And me talking to fighters, it's pretty clear that an overwhelming majority want it.
So if the Fighters Association is the easiest way to take care of this, and the majority of fighters want it, why does it not take place as well? Well, once again, it's not that easy. This has failed time and time again. Jeff Boras, the MMAAA, and most recently Project Spearhead. None of these have been able to get fighters collectively bargain rights. So what's the deal? Why has this seemingly best option not worked?
The problem is when you're an MMA fighter, your career might be 2-3 years at the point where you're at the top of the game and can make money. So any work stoppage, right? Any risk to your career, your momentum could be the end of any moment when you could make money or actually make a dent on the industry. And on top of that, there's nothing that says a fighter is one of the best fighters. Like we don't have independent sanction organizations. It's not boxing where the boxers own their rank. You know, the sanction organization put a rank, the boxer owns that rank. So they carry that rank with them no matter what promoter they're with. If you're an MMA, the promoter can cut you. The promoter can bring in someone else to the UFC, and those are now UFC fighters, and you're no longer a UFC caliber fighter. There's nothing that limits the number of top fighters. It's all up to the promoter. Are you a top fighter or not? And so it's very risky for fighters to do anything. And if none of them will come out and speak about wanting to have an organization or organizing or solidarity or union or association, anything you want to do, well, then it has a chilling effect because everybody assumes none of the other fighters are willing to do it.
So now you must be saying, wow, the antitrust lawsuit is probably gonna fail. Congress is a mess and they don't care about MMA, and the fighters cannot get on the same page, which makes collective bargaining extremely difficult. So it seems like nothing is gonna happen. Well, we might see small wins here and there, and we've already been seeing those. But with everything that's going on right now, the wholesale turnkey amazing revolution that people expect to happen overnight for fighters, it's pretty much out of the cards. So maybe, like all those people said, MMA is broken and there is no fixing it. But don't give up on it just yet, particularly if these small actions compound into major successes. And also, we can't ignore the fact that there might be new laws that we didn't cover right now that could come out of nowhere and save the fighters. But at the end of the day, only time will tell, because if you get banned from the UFC, you are pretty much done. You have nowhere else to go. You can watch this video to see what happened to people that got banned from the UFC. Some of them pivoted in a positive way, some of them didn't. And probably the most concerning fact about all of this that we talked today is the actual cost of MMA, which you can watch in this video right here. These sports have been changing lives for the better and for the worse. So check out other of those videos, and I'll see you in those ones. See ya!
Ballin' now, skirt down, all of these diamonds soap. Bottom for me, but they're yours now. You could drink it, but take it slow. Ballin' for you, falling for you.